steamy home, in the language of our speaker. Indeed, she wouldn't be here today were it not for my lovely wife who's listening right now in her art studio on the live stream, and I had to do that shout out. But in addition to Perry's recommendation, I asked our speaker here today because she identified a critical social issue, studied it in depth, came up with some solutions, earned her doctorate in the process, and is now activating that study into a living, breathing movement impacting individual lives around the country and hopefully nationally as well. Nettrice Gaskins earned her PhD at the Georgia Institute of Technology and Digital Media with funding from the National Science Foundation. We'll most likely hear about that research today. She's an artist and educator, currently serving as the STEAM Lab Program Director at the Boston Arts Academy. I hope you ask her lots of questions about that lab and during the Q&A. She blogs for Art21 Online Magazine and has contributed articles and essays on topics such as Afrofuturism, hip-hop, and advancing STEM through culturally situated arts-based learning. She has an article in the upcoming anthology Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Afro-Blackness, and that's due out in December. She's given TEDx Fenway talk about how the future is steamy, and just a few weeks ago, she participated at Princeton University's Ferguson is the Future, Incubating Alternative Worlds Through Arts, Activism, and Scholarship. Next week, she'll be meeting with representatives from the White House and will be part of a panel of art scholars where she is the only person from a high school. Among others, she can count Hank Shockley, known for his work with Public Enemy, as a fan. And you should ask her about that relationship also during the Q&A. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nettrice Gaskins.
So I actually had to condense about 70 slides to about 50, but hopefully this will work out fine. I'm going to actually go, the slides will just keep clicking, but I'll stop on some key ones so that people can sort of look at it as I'm talking. So the title of my dissertation and my research work at Georgia Tech was Techno-Vernacular Creativity, Innovation, and Learning in Underrepresented Ethnic Communities of Practice. And I'm going to get this advancing thing going on. So in terms of an introduction, I usually define vernacular as native language or dialect of a specific population, as opposed to language of a wider mainstream or dominant communication. And so, and I added this slide this morning. This actually happened at Rutgers. I was here in 1990 as an art and technology intern for the Summer Arts Institute. And during that time, I was at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, majoring in computer graphics, but I was also really into and inspired by street art and graffiti and hip hop and so on. So that was the year at Rutgers and the Summer Arts Institute that they actually had influx of urban students for the first time. So there's some nervousness about working with this population of students, which had changed the demographic of the program. They were here on Rutgers campus for 5 weeks. I was the RA, and then also I worked with them within the sort of film media section of the campus of the school in terms of where we were. So one of the things that I wanted to do is find a way to engage that population of students in a way that made them feel welcome and also explored some of the things that they were interested in. And a lot of them were interested in graffiti, and a lot of them were interested in hip hop. So we showed the Star Wars documentary and then had a discussion afterwards. And a lot of the students, I still remember his name's Frank, and other students produced a mural in conjunction with the screening of the video, and then some of them were doing computer graphics work as well. So I'm back now as a PhD, and so it's bringing me full circle in a lot of ways, also in terms of graffiti. So techno-vernacular creativity, or TVC, is cultural art and technology that's made by underrepresented ethnic groups, so indigenous, Native American, African, Latino diasporas, for their own entertainment and for their own creative expression. So my framework was looking at a few different sort of theories. One of them, Black vernacular creativity from Rayvon Fouché, engineer, science technology studies scholar. And he came up with some terms to sort of look at. He was looking at underrepresented ethnic groups, but specifically he was looking at Black or African American creators. And so this idea of redeployment of material and symbolic power of technology and so on. So what I realized that there was kind of a step that's right before that in terms of what you could describe would be that action. So as a result of reappropriation, underrepresented ethnic groups are able to redeploy and then bring in Fouché. The other is improvisation. They're able to reconceive technology in a way that transgresses the original design, function, and meaning, and then conceptual remixing, redesigning, producing new material, artifacts after the existing form and function has been rejected. So where my work comes in is sort of creating that framework for analysis to get to where Fouché was talking about in his work. So the idea was looking at reappropriation, remixing, improvisation, but also as a way of looking at what's happening in communities of practice. So they're contextualizing or recontextualizing or placing things in new and different contexts. They're synthesizing or seeing relationships between seemingly unrelated areas. They're syncretizing or they're inventing something new that no one, by combining elements that nobody else thought to put together. One example, this is a lowrider car culture from the Southwest and from Mexico, Chicano culture. So reappropriation in this case of automobiles and other similar types of things. And then by reclaiming the artifacts from a dominant culture, creating something brand new from it. So this is one example of reappropriation. Improvisation, so the spontaneous and inventive use of materials. A lot of the artists and practitioners I studied were both youth and adults, but they were often had no access to or resources that you might find in a suburban area or more well-resourced area. So this student, young person's name is Kelvin Doe, and he was brought in from Sierra Leone by MIT because he actually creates systems, he creates things. He's a DJ. He also brings parts together and to create his DJ craft and practice, but in really innovative ways. And he also has a TED Teen Talk. And he was hired about a year and a half ago, given a research grant from a Canadian company on solar panels, so he could have a research lab of his own at age 16 to develop solar panel technology for his community. This is Grandmaster Flash. Grandmaster Flash is known to be the inventor of the crossfader, which is now an international. Most DJs use a crossfader of some sort when they're DJing, but he created it in his mother's kitchen in the Bronx in the 70s. Similar to Kelvin Doe, with junk parts from whatever he found, and then put it together, and now it's in the Smithsonian. He's also known to be an innovator in hip hop in general for scratching and so on. So an important figure in hip hop. So after looking at this kind of work, I started thinking about this type of creativity within informal learning environments like after-school programs and so on. Could that increase interest and motivation in ethnic groups who are underrepresented in STEAM, and particularly in STEM? So the problem is, while the enrollment of underrepresented minorities in post-secondary schools is increasing, and underrepresented ethnic groups are more engaged in cultural art and technology, studies show that STEM achievement of those groups continue to decrease. This is a most recent chart from the National Science Foundation about scientists and engineers working in science and engineering occupations. You can see here where Black men, Black women at 3%, 2%, Hispanic 4%, 2%, Native American less than 1%. And that includes, and then it's also pretty low for Asian women. And that includes people who actually major in STEM. So even after they major, they do not go in the fields. And this is the most recent chart, and this chart before that I used during my dissertation, the numbers haven't changed. So the purpose of my study was to identify and analyze artworks by practitioners from underrepresented ethnic groups or communities that use STEM concepts. to explore how these works can be harnessed to engage underrepresented ethnic groups in STEAM and affect positive learning outcomes. So I started looking at artwork that was just kind of that I was writing about. I was meeting new artists. I was part of the art community. And I was noticing there were artists who were from those communities who were engaging STEM concepts in very direct ways. And, so I started creating maps and sort of guides to identify what those elements were, what those principles were. And then at some point I realized I was watching a lot of graffiti interviews or graffiti artists. They were talking math concepts or they were talking physics. And without having studied or at least having majored in physics or math. So I actually came up, well, there must be a direct relationship between graffiti and math. Most people I talked to at Georgia Tech in general thought I didn't know what I was talking about, that there is no connection between graffiti and math. My advisor said, well, find somebody who does know the connection, or at least, so I actually found Ron Eglash at a Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI, and he has a tool called Graffiti Grapher, which teachers and students can use to show how you can create a graffiti using math. And so he has an entire suite of programs called Culturally Situated Design Tools, or CSDTs. And these were taking things like Native American basket weaving to Latino music to, I'm trying to think of all the different things, African fractals, which he has a TED Talk was pretty well known about. So Ron became one of my external advisors and committee members, and we developed technology together as part of my research and working with his graduate students. So I did two things. I'm only going to talk about one of the major things that I did, but I did 4 workshops to examine the impact of combined research methods that I was looking at. Culturally situated design and learning, arts-based learning, and digital media. So the one I'm going to focus on in terms of presenting today, and that's how I reduce my number of slides, is to talk about the 4th and 8th grade students at a charter school in Metro in Atlanta, and a 6th to 7th grade students at another middle school a little bit outside of Atlanta. I also got funded from the NSF to do a professional workshop that brought together the artists that I was working with, plus astrophysicists, plus mathematicians, plus designers, plus technologists, to bring them all in a room to meet for 2 days and talk about the impact of their work in STEAM. So this is kind of the theoretical framework, prior research. So here you see the culturally situated design, arts-based research and interest in motivation and design. This piece, I could have probably got through it all without this piece, but I felt like I needed to show how this increased motivation and engagement. So I had to create an instrument and tool to measure that. So I was looking at Keller specifically, John Keller, and how he created tools around motivation and engagement. And so I was also, in general, looking at Black vernacular technical creativity from Fouché. I also put Amiri Baraka in because he actually wrote something in 1971 that we're at now. And Amir's no longer with us, but he prophesized where we are in technology, which I'll talk about soon. Vernacular arts and technology, which isn't necessarily digital, so architecture, other things that are kind of but the way in which culture has changed architecture. So now there's hip hop architecture, something, if you haven't looked that up, there's a certain area, subdomain of architecture. And then cultural and social practices in general. So these are Tone, Du Bois. So these are the CSDTs. This one is a cornrow curves tool. So looking at cornrows and using math principles and allowing people to graph it to learn how cornrows can be related to math. And this is also at Ron English's lab at RPI. This is where I began to look at how I'm going to identify the ways in which artists and practitioners are creating the work and how that can be assessed in terms of its relationship to different STEM connections. So, I came up with 6 different categories. They diagram, so translation, patterning, repeating, encoding, combining. So like repeating is looping, so hip hop and sampling, looping, replaying, reiterating, patterning, so the beat, the rhythm, and so on. And so those were common things that kept coming up over and over again in the works that I was looking at, that I felt was technological in some way. and help with my assessment, or at least creating the tools for assessment. So in this example, Natsa Kalilo, she's from Zimbabwe, and she does these kind of repetitions of patterns that she picks up from cornrows and from hair braiding. And so I worked with her in a gallery in New York, probably right before I moved to Boston, to sort of write about hair braiding as technology. So bringing in Ron's work, the cornrow curves, and bringing in sort of the kinds of things that were related to my taxonomy, I was able to identify this as something that we could use, create a software program, a learning program to understand this work. This is John Biggers, who passed away in 2001 in his 80s. His art is actually new as a young person. He was in a lot of Ebony magazine when I was a kid. He does a lot of patterning and diagramming and quilts. So his work is inspired by African-American, traditional African-American quilting, which is very different from European quilting or other types of quilting. So that is actually compared to jazz, hip hop, and by quilt scholars. So there's this relationship between those 6 categories and then what people are doing in their communities of practice, whether we're talking about hair braiding, we can also talk about quilting and textiles, in addition to music. So this is the tool that we worked on. So you can see the artist, Nancy's work here, and then working with the grad student and Ron, we produced this tool, which looks like Scratch out of MIT, but it's called CSnap. And this is a culturally situated design tool that allows you to simulate what Nancy does using computer programming and math principles. So just in terms of informal learning, kind of science context that I put together, there's a social cultural context, a personal context, and a physical context. And then I began embedding that in some of the other models. So this idea of engagement, building knowledge, applying knowledge, and then reflecting back. And then how when you're contextualizing, you're hanging out, you're in your group. Like for example, in graffiti, there's mastery of skills. So if you come into graffiti, you start off handwriting. So your script is important, and you're not advanced enough to go wild style or more complex until you go through a certain level of mastery. Then you get to a point where it becomes more abstract and more about sort of in a vernacular that if you're a graffiti artist, you know. But if you're outside of it, you don't understand it. This looks very complex. So you get that by hanging out with other graffiti artists. You get that by practicing with other sketching, sharing sketchbooks, and working and building assets. So then you begin to build things. You start to mess around. You go deeper. You're starting to build knowledge, and then you connect. Then you go way out, geek out, and then you can reflect back. So this is kind of where I was beginning to pull in a lot of other different types of contexts for learning, as opposed to just doing and practicing. Mixing it in and showing how they overlap or connect in my research. So John Keller has this motivational design model called ARCs. So attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. So attention, are they paying attention? Relevance, is it relevant to their lives in some way, their culture, present knowledge, prior experience? Does it help them feel like they can succeed? And then rewarded for their effort. And then you can sort of, there's a questionnaire you can develop based on these, and then you give the questionnaire, and then you kind of assess whether or not the activity workshop was increased their motivation. So then I took ARCs and took the arts-based inquiry and put that together with the models. So here we have ARCs on the side, and then you have personal context, physical, so you have the informal learning context, and then you have where the models come in. So culturally situated design, arts-based learning, and then digital media. So if you have one workshop, how you might use some of those techniques in one workshop. So if you wanted to get attention, how does the participant will write a talk about the artist's culture and their work and the work. Or they could talk about the art itself, the aesthetics, the style, and that's more arts-based. And then they could talk about technology that was used, if it's something that is an activity, just for attention, just to for relevance and so on. So this is getting to actually building the workshops that I was going to run and facilitate, and how I would approach addressing that and then assessing it later. So in terms of the research, getting to the end of my study, I started looking, I did three things. There was a preliminary observations and workshops. So I actually went to schools and did little workshops with students just to get a sense about, talk to teachers, work with teachers, math teachers, and kind of get a sense about what they might be interested in and do some activities. And then I did the professional workshop that was funded by the National Science Foundation or sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And then I did a final workshop with actual, like, this is the last, this is it. This is like, do, for real, and let's do that. And then assess that. So my preliminary observations and workshops, in terms of the students, they were 89% African American, 2% Hispanic, but less than 9% white or other. There were 100 eighth graders, and one of the diagramming things that I picked out from the 6 categories was mapping, to pick the thread to sort of follow. So mapping in different ways, mapping in terms of quilting, mapping in terms of design, mapping, and also mapping in terms of the way we use the software. And then luckily what happened that year is the dean of the Ivan Allen College decided to have a year-long citywide celebration of African culture and the diaspora in the Middle Passage. It's called Africa Atlanta. And so Georgia Tech's Paper Museum had an exhibition called Beyond Paper. And so they actually had maps of colonial maps, non-colonial maps, Lhasa personal memory maps, which are devices that the Lhasa people use to tell their personal stories, which are also based on math that Ron looked at. So it was turning out to be timely. And there was a digital tabletop, interactive tabletop mapping activity that the students were able to do. So I collected the data, collages, vision maps that they were doing, and then analyzed my field notes and so on. Personal meaning maps isn't invented by me. This is a technique to show before and after learning, or before and after. So you can see there's first layer, and then they get a little bit more, they add more information as they go along about what this means. So they may start very simply, and then you just keep layering more information on to sort of go through this whole process of learning how this means to me. So this is like from a city, street, or block, or neighborhood. And then in the workshops we were doing with the kids, we were using Google Maps. Here's your school and here's your neighborhood. Pick an area. Some kid picked Puerto Rico. Pick an area, and then let's design what it means to you. These things you're seeing in the mapping. So this is an example of this preliminary workshop at Drew Charter School with the Google Earth. And then they're identifying not just what it means to them, but they're identifying abstract shapes and ways, and then they're using math concepts such as rotation, translation. I can't remember all of them right now, but for 6th grade math or whatever. Rotation, translation, just trying to think, there's 4. And so they were using those math concepts to create the designs from the Google Earth maps, which eventually would become some of the techniques using quilting and other types of contemporary art. This is where I get a little more into it. This is a younger group at Drew, and they actually used iPad and a program called Romer Bearden Black Odyssey. It actually allows them to create, use Romer Bearden's quilt-inspired collage, and they can create their own. So they can create their own shapes, or they can use existing shapes. And so what's interesting about Bearden is Bearden remixed the Odyssey, and made it a Black journey of a Black hero instead of the original Greek. And then they developed this software that allows them to use his technique of collage. But then I noticed that kids were starting to do some of the 6 categories. They were repeating and diagramming based on our initial workshops. And then we did that in paper. And then they wrote about what they learned. So you can see all that here. And this is the first time, besides looking at Google Earth, that we use a digital tool to produce something. And then the last workshop we did was with a middle school where there were 95% American, 4% Latino, 1% white, 35 students made vision maps. They used culturally situated design tools, and they used interactive tangible media. So we're getting closer to digital media. And then I talked about the museum, I collected data, and did analysis based on rubrics I created, interviews, and questionnaires. The taxonomy again, so this is a little just, you know, you can see Ray Fouché kind of on the outside, coming through contextualize, syncretize, and synthesize to reappropriation, remixing, improvisation, and then eventually to those 6 categories that I use to assess what they learned in workshops. So this is a rubric for the culturally situated design tool. And I was looking at and this comes from the personality mapping model of the extent. So breadth, depth, and mastery. So uses diagramming with a given sample or script. Uses motion map path that makes a right angle turn. Creates diagram using pre-existing. And this is for the software specifically. So they're using the software and they're doing it in these different ways. Uses rotation, uses translation, and so on. And then assessing how they were able to, what level they got to individually and as a group. So results. So we, these are some of the personal meaning mapping and moving into the diagramming and patterning and with math concepts. We have with paper, we have this with these visual map projects, these quilt type of designs, and then the actual CSDTs. I'll say also briefly, so based on my research, I was working with a graduate student at RPI. My name is Libby Rodriguez. With Ron's oversight, we produced 3 software tools under an Afrofuturism CSDT, which is specifically for this research project. So the artists that I was looking at, they're all kind of in the Afrofuturism vein. So and they're all using maps in some way, quilting. They're all using patterns and things like that. So the 3 artists were Sanford Biggers, Zenobia Bailey, and Saya Woolfolk. Those are the 3, and then they all have some common relationship at the time, and they were able to pull a thread that was common throughout the artwork in terms of aesthetics and style, and then bring it into the math piece and the computer science piece with the software. So in terms of results, I gave statements in a survey. This is something interesting in the workshop that got my attention, so there's attention. You can see all the time. The pink is, so it's pretty clear that a lot of them were paying attention, at least attention was high there. This is for relevance. So there are examples of how people use math, technology, and art in this workshop. So you can see 44% chose all the time. Confidence. This workshop has things that makes me want to ask more questions. 44% chose all the time. Satisfaction. I enjoyed this workshop so much that I would like to know more about this topic. 75% chose all the time. And then I did interviews with students and coded according to expression and interest or curiosity, social interaction, and choice and control. Creative expression was always high. We were doing art, so that's not a surprise. Let's see. And so here it is again. And then I want to also, because we were talking science, we were talking mapping, technology, keywords that kept coming up in the interviews were coded. And a lot of them talked about art, but they also talked about math a lot. So findings, exposure to culturally responsive materials are important for underrepresented ethnic learners' self-concept and self-image. These groups need to see themselves reflected in STEAM, as well as the images of the practitioners themselves, so the artists themselves. Access to different tools allow participants to interact with materials and forms of technology and fostered a more intense media-centric form of learner engagement. So having different tools, iPads, the software, CSDTs, paper-based stuff, collage, that also helped to get their engagement. Making STEAM more meaningful and cultural led to changes in motivation and knowledge of how STEAM is used in art. STEM is used in art. Techno-vernacular creativity demonstrates the informal engagement of underrepresented ethnic groups in STEAM in ways that are not typically classified as information technology, science, or engineering. So a lot of this work that I'm talking about is a technology, but it's not seen as a technology in mainstream definitions of technology or science or engineering. but it is science and engineering. So making those things more clear is very important. Artistic or creative expression is essential to learning STEAM among these groups as a method for engaging Latino, African American, Native American students in STEAM. This project has implications for future culturally situated arts-based learning interventions and also collaborations. TVC supports several informal learning contexts that build on characteristics of interest among these groups as requisite for intrinsic motivation. The definition, so these are my 3 bullets from conclusions. The definition of technology, for example, needs to be expanded to include multi-ethnic and multilingual qualities of culturally diverse groups as it relates to STEAM. If kids don't think that people like them do technology, they won't do technology. If kids like these kids think that people don't do engineering in their community, they don't do engineering. You might have an outlier, someone like me that might, but in my case, my mother was a computer programmer. I don't like programming, but I know how to program. I was exposed to it all my life. So TVC provides culturally situated and culturally responsive learning contexts for these groups to learn and master tools in innovative ways. In order for STEAM to be motivating, it has to be based on a careful match between different options and needs and interests, goals, abilities, and cultural backgrounds of the target group. So you may have a model, but you have to figure out how to make it relevant in order for it to be motivating them to learn. So future work. Here's my hero, Hank Shockley, and the STEAM lab I run at Boston Arts Academy. So a couple of things are happening in this picture. You can ignore the 3D printing station that's just sitting there. That's over there, somewhere over there. These are 9th graders presenting a project inspired by Hank, to Hank, that was in an engineering class. The challenge of this class was to create a new way to get to the core unit that they had to uncover, which was communications technology. So what we used conductive paint, electric paint, that's used instead of wire to create circuitry and based on touch. So you touch the paint and sound plays. So basically they were creating instruments using paper and conductive paint and learning about how circuits work, how electricity works, how they also use Arduinos to light up LEDs, and did a little bit of understanding what, looking at the programming that's required to do that. And this is the first time they've ever done this. So they all did different projects, and then each group gave Hank a presentation about how they created some sort of music device using poster board and electric paint and what they've learned in their science class. Hank's role was to learn from them and also discover the kinds of things, what they were interested in, what they were listening to, what kinds of sounds they were using, how they were using it. These are really interfaces. They're developing their own interfaces. So how that translates to the science projects that they have. I think this might be, yeah. So I'm going to show a video. And the video is a 1-minute video of an event. In addition to going to classes and meeting students and having students present or ask them questions, he also, one of the groups, they have extracurricular groups, game club. One of the clubs is the hip hop freestyle cipher club. And that club met in the STEAM lab, usually, at the time. And so having Hank there to mentor young people who are music technology, since Boston Arts Academy has music major, dance major, theater, and visual art, the goal was to, sort of do something that was like interdisciplinary in a space for right after lunch and have Hank involved. So